Hello and welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the vlogcast that gives you a peek inside the minds of some truly inspirational teachers. During this episode, I sit down for a chat with Jack Harker, a Year 4 teacher and archaeologist from Kent, who shares his experience of teaching in the southeast of England, as well as outlining his take on how time-poor teachers can utilise research in the classroom. Whether you're new to teaching or a school leader with tons of experience, then as always, this interview is a must listen. And if you happen to be listening on your preferred podcast provider, don't miss out on the extended cut in which Jack takes on the foundation topic tier list, ranking some of his favourite foundation subject topics. Full interviews are available from the Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics YouTube channel or thinkingdeeply.info, where full show notes and references can be found. Now, without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. Welcome, Jack. It's great to have you here. I'm going to start with Jack in numbers, so you can only answer using numbers. Just to get a feel for who you are, where you've come from. So first question is years as a teacher.
I couldn't work it out. It's either 15 or 14, but I couldn't find my certificate.
Number of schools?
Number of schools, 3 schools.
Last year group taught?
It's year 4.
Favorite year group?
It would have to be 4, but anything otherwise I'd probably get in trouble with.
And most important year group?
Do I have to answer this with a number or not? I think out of every question, that's probably the hardest one to answer. Am I allowed to say every year group?
That's quite a common answer, actually.
From birth to 99. In the classic board game style age bracket, I think.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'll maybe push you on that later on. So you're currently teaching year 4 in Northwest Kent. Tell us about your journey and how you got here.
So I've always taught in quite a small sort of area in Kent, and haven't really moved much from it, but within that I've sort of taught from year 3 to year 6, and also a number of years in special school as well. So I started in primary, moved to special school, and then came back to mainstream. And prior to that, I failed an engineering degree, successfully completed an archaeology degree, and spent a number of years pottering about doing a wide variety of jobs, from managing bars to CADS drafting to to anything really, sometimes 2-3 jobs at once, and then ended up in teaching really. While I was working at a bar, I became a TA. So I was a TA by day, barman by night. And then realised that, that's what I want to be. I want to be a teacher. And did my PGCE at Avery Hill, and came back to Kent where my parents are based, and sort of stayed there ever since. When I was younger, I think I had grand plans to live across the world, but sort of managed to get about 10 miles away from home. So I'm happy with that at the moment.
There's still plenty of time as well. So that's really interesting, the jump from mainstream to special school and then back to mainstream. Did that have, how much of an impact did that have on your practice when you come back to the mainstream, having spent that time in special education?
Okay. Well, it was quite a funny time really, because I went through a period of sort of 6 years where I was quite seriously ill, and it did affect all my teaching. So my time at special school was quite tough. I ended up having quite a serious operation, which was successful, but it's those 6 years is sort of a lot was taken out of me, flesh and mentally as well. And I think it was like a new start, really. And it was a total different place to where I'd left mainstream. A lot different. And initially that was quite a big shock. I think I sort of left mainstream at the time when schools were still allowed to be acceptable, and sort of came back, and it was a much more pressured environment, and it took a bit of getting used to. But I can't see myself going back to special school now, when I think at some points in my time there I couldn't see myself going back to mainstream. We'll see what happens in the future,
because things have changed a lot over the last 10 years, and I think we've done quite well, because a lot of the things that we hold dear, in terms of knowledge and academic rigor, are sort of front and center of the conversation. But it's really interesting that you think, or that your interpretation is, that schools are more pressured now. And what do you think drives that pressure?
I think it's Ofsted. I think at the time when I left mainstream, it was only just beginning to be recognised that lots of schools were sort of coasting along at that sort of second level of Ofsted, which is now unacceptable. And I think with it brought a lot of sort of pressure on schools, some of which adapted brilliantly. Some, I think, struggled with that pressure. I think I've been lucky enough to work at schools that have sort of reduced that pressure on teachers. On teacher staff, and haven't passed it through.
I get you. And one of the things that stands out to me is that maybe 10 years ago, there was a formula that if you learned the formula, you could get outstanding at Ofsted. But now the burden of thought and consideration is on the schools. I think that's a big difference. Because it was I think very easy to play the game in 2008 when I started. You learned the game, you played the game, and you were successful in the game. But now, I think there's a lot more onus on the schools to decide exactly how they are meeting the given standards and the sort of the expectations from Her Majesty's Inspectorate.
Yes, I remember dressing up as Sherlock Holmes for an Ofsted inspection once, so, for a computing lesson, no less. That they didn't come in, unfortunately, so it was all wasted. Deerstalker was nice though.
Yeah, I think there's teachers around the world have nightmares about those kind of lessons.
Yes, although I think what hasn't, like, teaching is also amazingly consistent in that the children haven't really changed a lot, and despite sort of the massive increase in sort of technology use by children over the past sort of 6 years in particular, they do remain remarkably consistent. So that aspect of it, and sort of the basic classroom practice, has always remained sort of a constant, really.
So, well, I think that's a really good segue into sort of my first big question. Really, what I'd like to know are, what are the 4 key features of a Jack lesson? If you describe your teaching in 4 easily digestible points, what would they be?
I think it's probably keeping the individual lesson within the sort of the sequence, making clear where that lesson is within the bigger picture, whether that's a unit of maths or whether it's a history unit, computing unit, making the learning explicitly clear what we're learning. And I think that's looking back on when I first started teaching, it was sort of that very much activity based. What looks, someone's observing, what activity will make me look brilliant, which I was very well. I think everyone was very good at it, really, and those people perhaps who weren't so good at putting on a show at the time suffered. But it's what are we looking at, and this is what we're addressing in that lesson, and along with that, the vocabulary within that lesson, being very explicit about that. That's something I'm quite interested in at the moment, and trying to keep it consistent across every lesson, which is hard because, especially as in my class, I guess less so this year, but in past years we've had very, very high turnover of pupils. So you've got all these children have been taught in different ways, with different vocabulary, and it's trying to, you have to be so clear, so they all understand the same thing and what is meant by everything. So I think perhaps consistency of language, clarity of what I want them to learn, I guess is a better thing, and where that's positioned within the grand scheme of things, whether that's a sequence of lessons or larger than that. I do like to know what's going on in other year groups. I wish I had more time to do that. And finally, possibly a feature of my lesson is always running over at the end. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think traditionally it would be a sign of poor pace, whatever that means, whatever that entails. But I think that you have to spend time on things to be able to understand them. And if you don't give that allotted time to things, then you've always got bits of this and you've got bits of that. And that's confusing for everyone.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100% on that. Yeah, I think it's taken a long time for us to get away from the idea that everything that humans know can be put into an hour-long slot and disseminated within that time. So I think, sometimes, you can be weeks on the one question. It depends on what the question is or the one problem. I'm thinking about maths, obviously, because that's all I think about at the minute. Having to have 3 parts and having to finish in an hour and then to link exactly to the next bit. That I think that's something that we're slowly but surely getting away from. So I'm totally with you there. And I think the vocabulary is really interesting. And I can see exactly why it's important. Obviously having that shared language in the class, those shared representations of the big ideas. How do you go about making sure that the pupils have that consistent language? What are your sort of go-to strategies for language development across the curriculum, really?
I do find it quite hard in some subjects, mainly because we haven't got that sort of overall picture as a class teacher, and you don't have the time, especially not this year, to get together and to really hammer out a sort of consistent scheme of vocabulary, really. At the beginning of each unit, I do tend to have a big think about the key. What do I want to teach? What do I want to teach? But I won't have the time to teach. What can be taught sort of elsewhere in a way, and then going from that, what vocabulary do I want to use throughout that? what words, I mean, even in terms of grammar, children's definitions of adjectives, nouns, verbs varies wildly over what teachers they've had, what songs they've sung in reception in year one, and I would love it all to be very, very consistent. Sometimes I like being told what to do, I think.
Grammar is something we haven't really scratched the surface on. And it's only when you look at other languages, and for instance, how a lot of the grammatical features are indications of mood, and they're not being a future tense, so to speak, in the English language. But we don't ever really get near that. But we still go quite deep, I think. And so you're absolutely right. Because we don't, as adults, go that far, then it's very rare that we'll actually go that far with the children, unless we have a particular passion for linguistics and that kind of those features of the curriculum. Yes, I think it's really interesting you say that, because it's only through sort of personal interest that I'll sort of come to understand the actual depths that some of the things, for instance, like the subjunctive, and how we get off pretty lightly with the subjunctive form, or the subjunctive mood in English. But when you start looking at things like French, or any of the Romance languages, it's a totally different story. And actually, I think we'd probably be better prepared for being a multilingual society if we did go a bit further. But I think we got to sort out where we are first before we can start dreaming of things like that.
Yes, and I have to say that I've never enjoyed learning languages, and and that's possibly why I seek out those definitions. I want to see it there, because I've just tried, as you know, Kieran, my wife's French, and I've absolutely failed to be married for over 10 years and a complete failure in understanding the French language. French culture, the wine I can do, the language.
Yeah, I think maybe it's just 10 years of assimilation, and you'll get there eventually. Positive, open thinking. And so you utilize a high quality textbook in your mathematics lessons. Have you always used
Yes.
them? And tell us about your process and how you get the most from this resource.
So no, I was thinking about my practice when I first started teaching mixed year 3-4 class, so quite similar to my current role, year 4. We had mixed ability sets that split for maths, but only maths. So maths was taught in sort of the higher, middle, and upper. I don't remember having anything other than the lower group, and it was totally different. I remember struggling with maths, and out of all the subjects that I taught when I first started teaching, I think I found maths the hardest. And it was probably something I was least looking forward to going back to mainstream. And using a textbook, which I'd never done before, was a real eye opener. It was it took a lot of the load off of me in terms of how do I structure the progression, instead of going on to TES to find reams of the same problem. They were there structured, and there was a reason for each one. So it's freeing up my time really to be able to think about the students' progression through the work and my aims for them. and what I can do for them, as opposed to spending that time thinking about what do I do next, what do I move on from. I think they are seen by some as these very rigid articles. You must follow this doctrine, you must go, and although there's that clear progression in them, I'm sure that there are people who can come up with equally great examples of each thing, but it would take me absolutely hours and years to produce something like that wasn't based upon the research that is based on. And it's having that time to focus on the pupils. I can't see how you could. We teach the children, and not to sort of reinvent mathematics curriculum every year. And I don't know how anyone could sort of argue against that, really.
Yeah, well, obviously I'm a big proponent of high quality textbooks. So when you say it frees up your time to think about the children, so what would that entail? What sort of things would you be thinking about when you don't have to think about the structure of the curriculum or the sequencing? What sort of things do you then have time to really consider?
Yes, it's the misconceptions, the children that have frequent sort of misunderstandings are so much easier to pick up on. You've got that time to analyze where they've gone wrong, and once you get your head around the idea that the questions are in there for a reason, and that each one is almost a diagnostic question, that becomes much easier. Thinking about how you can extend the pupils, provide challenge to the most able, as always, and think about sort of how the class's maths work as a whole sort of can looks going forward. You get a much better idea of your class. I don't think, looking back, I could have said this person needs to work on this person needs to work on that, without doing a fair amount of assessment. As I think, looking at my class now, I know exactly what each child struggles in. I've had that time to really look at their work and know what I need to do to make them better.
And do you think that's because you've been in the same year group for a couple of years now? Like, at what point did you think you became
Possibly
so familiar with the textbook that actually you were then able to make it your own, essentially?
I think it is fairly easy to pick up a new textbook now. I mean, during lockdown, I had to switch at various points to other year groups, and I think if once you're used to using the textbook, I don't think it's that hard. I think that always if you're going up in a year group, it's slightly harder than going down a year group, because there is more content. But I think that it is using a textbook's quite easily accessible. I think that possibly the biggest obstacle is sort of teacher mindset sometimes, and the sort of the traditional view of a textbook. Certainly teachers probably from my generation, as sometimes teachers who've been teaching for longer than I have are more open to textbooks because of the experience they've had in the past, as I've had zero, really.
Yeah, I think even the most staunch opponents very quickly get on board, in my experience, because they see all those benefits you've described. But it is shaking that dirty name that it's got. I don't know where that came from, but I think if you look at the utilization in around the world. I think, you know, there's a lot more we can get out of high quality textbooks, and I think any worries, you know, I think I said this in the book, come from errors of management rather than anything that the textbook itself has done. Yeah, so it's really good to hear about your experience. I think definitely, you know, it matches up with mine in terms of, I think people get on board very, very quickly, because they see how useful it is and what the pupils can achieve, you know. And certainly whenever I start teaching, having to plan anything from scratch, it was the national strategy document. I wish we'd had textbooks, because I had to learn the English. I had never seen the national strategies when I moved over, and so it would have been really helpful to have a more in-depth guide than was available at that time.
I think I've still got it on my shelf somewhere.
Yeah, I've even got the one that they published and then didn't use. You know, they sent out millions.
Collector's item.
Yeah, I might put it on eBay, see what it fetches. Tell us about your approach to teaching in the foundation subjects. You know, what are the most important features? How do you plan? And are there differences in the process between subjects?
Yes, so being a class teacher in primary school, it sort of requires you to know everything, really, doesn't it? And it's sort of, as I go on through my teaching career, I sort of increasingly think that definitely towards the later years of primary school that we should be moving towards a more specialist approach. But there's I'm sure there are some teachers out there who are equally good at every single subject, amazing at them all, or equally bad, I guess. But it's such a task sometimes, sort of, to look at all these subjects and know everything about them. When you approach planning them and looking at them, you've got to think about the pedagogy of each subject as well, which is different, but then also the essence of teaching is the same whatever you're teaching. So I think the thing I find most difficult about it is that some subjects in the national curriculum have explicit skills mentioned in the national curriculum, as when other subjects are mostly knowledge. I'm using those words very loosely there. For me, it's a case of what do I want them to learn? What knowledge do I want to give them by the end of this lesson? And then doing that. So in that respect, I suppose it's not that much different, but it's how do you get there in DT, for example? How do you teach those evaluation skills? How do you teach those design skills? And how do you sort of ensure the consistency across the subjects as well?
Your subject knowledge in areas like history is it's unsurpassed. What's your secret to developing
some areas of history, perhaps,
such a deep and rich bag of knowledge, because that allows you to bring the subject to life in the classroom? So what are your tips on developing that subject expertise? Because you're absolutely right, you have to know so much more than we used to.
Yes. So playing a lot of pub quizzes helps. I think I'm quite lucky in that I am literally a jack of all trades, I think, in the fact that I've got quite a good knowledge of sort of things, of almost completely useless facts, in which most aspects of life would be completely useless, but work out quite well when teaching primary school children. I think you've got to have an interest in story, really, and I really dislike the word narrative. I'm going to use it, sort of there is a big narrative in every subject. History's an obvious one, but even in DT, there's sort of that curve of the design process, and I think it's to increase subject knowledge is hard, and I think the main reason it's hard is the lack of time that teachers have, the lack of time that anyone has, really. I think you ask most people, your average man on the street or woman, would like to know more about something, but just hasn't got the time to do that. And it's trying to find that time. And it's, as a teacher, I think it's very easy to look at a certain subject and go straight to certain websites that have a lot of resources. I won't mention any names, quite often of which aren't completely accurate as well, which is one of my personal bugbears. A lot of subject knowledge can be found quite easily, because although there is a wide range, there isn't that much in the course of a school year that the children actually have to learn. But it's putting that knowledge into context that's the hardest bit, and that's the bit that requires a little bit more subject knowledge. It's to knowing which parts of that to select, which parts to leave out, which parts don't matter, and why they do and don't matter, why they do matter. I think that history is a good example in the fact there's lots of interesting bits in history, but we can't fit them all in, and you have to make that selection as a teacher or as a subject lead, and you have to have very good reasons to select those bits, and if you don't have that subject knowledge, then that task is going to be very difficult. I was watching recent series of science videos on Twitter talking about curriculum. They're more secondary based, but it was very enlightening to see those misconceptions that arise at secondary school because of primary school teaching. As primary school teachers, we need to have much more contact with our secondary school colleagues, in terms of knowing even what happens at secondary school before we even consider the subject knowledge components. And there's this huge bank of experienced teachers that have very little contact with the teachers that are teaching a few months before them, and I think that's why sometimes you hear secondary teachers talk a little bit disparagingly, especially in foundation subjects, about primary school pupils' learning, and it shouldn't be that way. I'm not saying that they're just doing it to be mean. There appears to be some sort of definite disconnect there that we could work on. I think I've come off my subject knowledge. I think I put my subject knowledge down to being a geek, really, to be honest. I don't know if that's good advice. Be more geek. I don't know. Wanting to know, I just want to know everything, and I think that helps. I'm one of those weird people who won't turn the radio station off, because whatever radio station the last person has set it to, it's always something quite interesting, whether that be pop music, whether that be Radio 4, 5 Live, anything really. Yes, it's being open, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sorry, that was quite meandering.
No, that's perfect, because I think anything we can do to close that disconnect and close that chasm between the two phases, even though, like you said, there's only a few months between them, sometimes is a positive. If you were going to restructure the education system in primary to a specialist model, what would that model look like? Obviously I'm putting you on the spot, but what do you imagine when you think of that?
Actually, I was thinking about this either this morning or last night, and I haven't, I have to say, done much reading into it. And I was pondering, there's obvious advantages to having a class teacher approach, and there's obvious advantages to having a specialist teacher approach. And I think at some point there must be a tipping point or a perfect allocation of percentage taught by a class teacher compared to a percentage taught by a specialist. So I was wondering how would that look like? And I would sort of envision sort of a gradual increase of specialist teachers going up the school. So by the time they reached year 6, possibly I'd imagine them to be almost very similar to secondary school. As down in year 1, I wouldn't imagine it to be much different to what it is in most schools nowadays. I think all schools have done a little bit of that anyway. I think PPA at some schools almost is that. Certainly, I know many schools that have a language specialist in that time, and as far as I'm aware of, children are able to cope with that from quite a young age. It would just be expanding upon that, and perhaps making that transition to secondary a little easier as well.
It's really interesting that you mention misconceptions. I was reading a book by Hector Ruiz Martin, and it's basically a cognitive science book for teachers. And he talks about, I think it was either Stanford or Harvard, and when they tested their graduates, when they were asked about what creates the seasons, he talks about, they said it was because the Earth was closer to the sun, which is that's a misconception, isn't it? It's about the angle. I don't know, you're looking at me as if I'm wrong, Jack, but either way, there's a study.
Yeah, no, yes.
So
yes, and I think that's what most people say.
Yeah, but it's really interesting that that's clearly a problem even for the most affluent and sort of well-educated of us, that we can't escape those misconceptions. So maybe it's a focus on how we structure the education system that's needed, not just in England, but if that study comes from the United States, perhaps there too.
I have heard of that study, and one of my initial thoughts of that was it's us that's getting closer or nearer to the sun. It's where you are, isn't it? So it's almost the shortest day of the year. So we're at our furthest point here, almost at that point, where we're tilted away from the sun. But it always strikes me is that sort of it's the confusion between oneself and the Earth. So it's almost a human view of it. It's you are the center of your Earth, aren't you? So you are almost getting closer or further away. And I always wonder if things like that are sort of almost semantics, or rather than conceptual errors. But
I think in the diagrams I've seen, they thought the Earth's orbit was at one point
closer. All right,
physically closer to the sun as part of its elliptical orbit.
All right.
Rather than
that's a different matter anyway.
Because we are technically closer. I think I just didn't describe it properly. And the one diagram I saw, the Earth had almost like like an oval shape, and during the summertime it was closer. But actually, it's the angle and the amount of spread, isn't it? As to, there's more heat coming onto a smaller
Yes.
surface during the summertime. Yeah, and yeah, it's really interesting.
Yes.
Um,
And it's, I think it raises the point as well. If when you're studying these things, you've only got in entire your entire education history, you've only got a short time to spend doing each thing, and we have to consider that time is really precious. If you've only got a few weeks to learn about the solar system, that's going to be the only time you look at it in the whole of your primary, possibly only the course of your whole education, then it is really important. And so I think sometimes we sort of underestimate the importance of that. Certainly when it comes to doing things like the Romans, which, as far as I'm aware, aren't repeated at any point. You've got that one term, and that's it. So that's the entirety of what you'll learn about the Romans in that one term, which is it's a little scary, come to think of it. So you are solely responsible for any misconceptions that those children will hold about the Romans. Think of the fun you could have with it.
that's a terrifying way to describe it, Jack. So you have responsibility for a few loosely connected subjects. How do you lead for school-wide change? In science, for instance. And is there a difference between your approach in science and, say, computing?
Yes, so I lead on both science and computing, and there's a big difference. I think that science has had a clear scheme in place, as a few years ago, computing as it is in the newer curriculum was non-existent. So it's coming from those two areas. What do you need to improve standards in those subjects? But your start off is completely different, where your starting point's much different. So in science, for example, everybody knows what they're doing, but possibly not doing it in the best way, or the way that I might want them to do it in, or concentrating on the possibly the wrong aspects. As in computing, for example, I knew that sort of the computer science aspect was completely missing, really. So in one case you're trying to change practice, and in the other case you're trying to introduce practice. And I think introducing it's easier. So my approach there was to introduce little bits, start off with something that was very, I suppose, trying to use online tools in the same way that we utilized the textbooks in maths, was finding something that provided those small steps and clear modeled instructions that teachers could also model. So you could follow a clear sort of I do, we do, you do process within that. And then once you've built up that teacher knowledge, again, going back to vocabulary, the sort of knowledge of what coding is, knowledge of what an algorithm is, asking teachers about their subject knowledge was quite illuminating. Again, some of the older teachers remembered doing coding on the BBC computers, sort of must have been back in the early 80s, which is, and actually had much more knowledge than teachers from my generation, which was quite interesting. Comparing that to science was more looking at how can we do it better, how can we make sure that our practical work in science, which we have to do, I feel. I know that there is a school of thought that says that we should reduce all practicals, but as long as that practical work and that those working scientifically strand is in there in the national curriculum, I think it's something we have to do. But how do we make those as targeted as possible? How do you make those as effective as possible to achieve specific aims? So reducing the amount of learning in it, really. Not doing a practical to teach new things, but to do a practical to reinforce scientific concepts while teaching. But the actual thing you're teaching is the practical work, whether that's be to measure something or to be identify what a variable is, for example. And that's your focus for your practical work, as opposed to trying to teach children that sound is a wave through a practical. Just the load is too great. But yeah, working on individual improving practice within a subject that teachers are much more confident in, I found to be trickier than introducing something new. I think you'll always have a resistance to most things, to change from in any area of life, really. I know myself, I like things to be the same. I like to exist within my own area, own little bubble. I don't want it to change. And I think that's when you're trying to change something that's much more embedded, I think it's harder than trying to introducing something new. And I think that the history of sort of education in this country has sort of scared off a lot of teachers from change and new things as well. Going towards sort of evidence-led practice, I think there is a certain resistance, not because of the evidence, but because of the change aspect, and having seen so many things sort of pass through. I think there's some teachers are worried, is this another one of these things? And in another few years, will go the same way as learning styles and brain gym. Obviously, I'd like to think not. Hoping not, but I think it is a very real worry for some, and I think that's something when you're implementing change, a subject that you have to take into account, and I think that needs the support across the school, which the school I'm working at, I think we've got. Yeah, I think that sometimes it's we don't apply the things we do in the classroom to teachers learning as well. When we are still learners, we need that success, probably need a certain degree of difficulty as well, and yeah, it's so we want all of those things, and need to be guided, and I guess we need to obtain that high success rate of teaching in terms of ourselves as well.
Yeah, I'm convinced there's not much difference in supporting adults or supporting teachers and teaching children. You know, a lot of the principles will generalize
precisely. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. So you've recently begun to re-engage with reading about education. Why?
I, you said re-engage. I would miss out the prefix, to be honest. I think even when I was doing, well, possibly because I was doing a PGCE, I don't think that. Yeah, I don't think I ever really engaged it in the first place.
That's fair
But
enough.
continue. Sorry.
So, why do you do it, and how do you find the time with so much else going on?
I think the time is a big problem. I've got two children. One's still at preschool, and I've tried in recent years to reduce sort of my workload, to do more things myself and family, and so time is a big pressure. But I've also found that what I'm always looking for is things that will make me more effective, and if I'm more effective, then I'll also be more efficient and therefore have more time. So I think time spent is probably gives a good return. I think the reason why is because I've from A levels, I've always studied science. Even though I've got an archaeology degree, it's a BSc, and I think it's so many things I've sort of read have been sort of justified things I've thought, it's sort of niggling things that I've thought, and that sort of encouraged me to read on. And it's always wanting, I guess, to be the best that you can do. I don't. I've never been a very ambitious person, but I do like to do my best. And although I've definitely find, I think everyone at some points finds some things hard. I think that's natural. But you want to become better at your work, and that little time I have, I want to spend it reading something that will make me more effective and is proven to make me more effective, as opposed to something that might want to make me more effective, might make me more effective. And it's interesting. I don't think when I first started teaching, I really enjoyed teaching the children. I was never interested in research behind it. I don't think my tutors at university were that interested in teaching me the theory behind it either, to be honest. I think it was a very much sort of vocational teaching, I guess, in a way. Less academic, which which sort of disconnected with the paperwork that you had to do as well. But the reason I look at it now, to make myself better, to make myself more effective, and to make my pupils' lives better, I guess, in the end, when it all comes down to, is that you want to do the best as a teacher. I don't think many teachers would be teachers if they didn't believe in doing the best they could for the children, and best to do for in terms of the whole educational system. Really, I think you want to make children's lives better. You want to make society better, and that you have a responsibility to do the best that you can, and to be the best teacher that you can be. May not always be the best you want to be, may not always reach that point, but to do that most effectively, then you can't just do what you want or what feels right, which I think has been the case. And it's very interesting and worthwhile to get involved in in that research.
I find it fascinating. I think it really interests me that that's not a universally adopted position, and it's not necessarily everyone's first port of call. I think time has a lot to do with it. So I hope that people go through PGCs now or teacher training now through various avenues have the chance to engage with sort of literature that will keep them going throughout their careers, because I think, like you say, we're all better served, and most importantly, our pupils are better served by having the most effective teachers possible. So yeah, I totally agree with you there. And so every guest is asked about their research thunderbolt. So that is the standout paper that, in The Godfather Part 2, you were awoken from your slumber and the world was completely different. What would your thunderbolt be?
See, I was thinking about this, and I thought, well, I'm. I guess I feel I've been awoken slowly and gradually in a kind of nice kind of like a bear arising from hibernation and wandering around for a little bit before. So I guess there was. I feel more like I was sort of drip fed into it. Having reading little bits at a time. I've never been able to concentrate very well on academic papers. I find it really hard to read through them. So I think it was constant little realizations. Definitely, I think that the real probably a couple of books really that someone had left lying around the staff room. I wonder who that could have been. And starting off with the maths and Craig Barton's book, How I Wish I'd Taught Maths, and just reading snippets of that and then expanding from there really. I don't think there was one big wow moment throughout it. Sort of throughout my, I think it's sort of a lot of things that didn't quite sit right in the past, and you sort of did things, and you go and multitudes of them, I guess, rather than one big wow moment.
I understand that, and every response to that question is different, and I think you're right. Quite often, some of the things that we know are reasonably counterintuitive. And so it does take multiple readings sometimes from different authors to sort of convince us that something's worth, sort of an avenue worth traveling down. But if I can push you on this one, is there an academic paper that every primary teacher should read?
Yeah, so I think that my choice for that would probably be The Principles of Instruction, Barrett Rosenshine, possibly through the medium of Tom Sherrington's blog post on it, because that's really good. I think it's got Ollie Cab's graphic on it as well. I would say that sort of as a starting point, as for everything that you teach really. Before I read it, I'd probably heard of bits of it, and it sort of put it all together. And that's what I'd choose. If I had to go back, I'd probably tell my younger self to read that first.
Yeah. Because it's clear and concise, and you've got a lot of information in a very small space, which is exactly what you need if you're time poor.
Yes, I was going to say
for practice.
Exactly, and it's that sort of thing that's been really helpful to me. I think that sort of the walkthrough book is excellent for that as well. Although sort of combining a huge amount of information into easily digestible chunks.
So then the last thing we do, Jack, is a tier list. And so if you're not familiar with a tier list, we have 4 categories on mine. S is seminal, and then anything above B is a good outcome. B is about average, and C is your subpar. And so we have different
What have we got?
Topics, if you want to call them, sort of very common bits of history that get taught in primary school. And
bits of history. I think this could be very. This is like tightrope walk, isn't it?
Well, I think it's totally your opinion. It's a tier list, so it's all opinion based. And as you're an archaeology specialist, I thought best to get your opinion on this. So if we reveal the first one, we have dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs. I used to really love dinosaurs when I was a kid, but I just get annoyed when people say I'm an archaeologist. I have to explain to them the difference between being an archaeologist and being the difference between archaeology and paleontology. So for that reason, I'm going to put that in C, just because, just because I don't want it to have anything to do with history. Because of that, it will just reinforce that misconception of people that I dig up dinosaurs, or I dug up dinosaurs' bones, when in reality it was post medieval fortification,
which I'm sure is just as interesting to 10-year-old kids as dinosaurs.
Tell that to my kid. Yes.
The next one is pirates and piracy. So we're talking 1500s.
Pirates. Oh, but see, pirates is an excellent topic because it's so vast. I mean, it sort of represents, I think, a bit of human nature, sort of that living beyond the rules, that sort of got cultural links to sort of across the world and through multiple times. So so it's definitely A or above. See, I reckon Neil probably put this into the S, because I seem to remember him doing a topic on pirates that he put on Twitter. But see, I'm going to put it into A because it's not one of the classics, but the amount of learning you can get out of it is absolutely vast, and definitely a really good topic to do.
Nice. I've forgotten more names.
And possibly a later. The more you get out of it, the higher up in education that you do it.
Yeah,
I think it's could be studied all the way up. It's the topic that keeps on giving.
So the next one is the Stony Age.
So I'm going to. I was often annoyed in my archaeology course about the amount we did on early man, but it is sort of so important to sort of the history of where we come from, and it's got to be an S straight away. Loath as I am to admit it.
The Tudors. There's Henry VII.
The Tudors. So yeah, I can't not put this on S. Really, I think it's the beginning of the modern Britain, really, where Henry VIII, in particular, took us away from sort of our course of being a sort of peripheral. I don't know if that's even a word. A nation on the periphery of Europe to being the future world power. Whatever bad or good came from that, but you can't deny it's that sort of that period of change that's really important. And it was my specialist subject, so I can't not put it in S.
So the next one is the ancient Greece.
Ancient Greece. Again, not one of my favorites. I love the stories. I love the myths. But I think it was another one of those over taught ones in my archaeology degree. A democracy. See, I always feel with the ancient Greeks is I feel it overshadows the sort of those civilizations. With Egypt as well, they sort of the focus is very much on Greek and Egyptian civilization, and we sort of ignore that sort of genesis of civilization between the Tigris and the Euphrates that I'd sort of love to do more of. However, just because of that sort of democratic link, and we're going to have to put that in S as well.
Yeah,
I guess.
It's up to you.
Yeah.
And then the final is the idea of artists and teaching art through artists.
Oh. So I'm looking at my lab, and it's sort of like, yes, I've put all the ones that are in the national curriculum or have been traditionally at the top, and then I guess they're there for a reason. So it's an interesting one. I think it represents sort of a different way of teaching history, and one I've thought about, and having that sort of those themes going through history. The history of art is so much intertwined with history that it's almost kind of hard to cover it all. And hence why there's degrees in the history of art, I guess. I like the idea, but I'm sort of thinking about like the seminal ones, meaning the ones that I feel that you have to teach it in that way. I feel that it can't be an S because you could teach it in another way. You could teach the history involved in another way. I like the idea of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like I should put it in B because there's nothing there, but I like pirates, and it's for the same reason. It's it's the difficulty in teaching it, in the fact you have to know so much about the art of the time as well. And I could see how you'd have to be very specific about it. I love the idea of that whole sort of primary source material. I'm going to put it in A. What's the right answers?
There are no right answers. It's your turn. So we've got poor old dinosaurs in C.
Sorry, dinosaur lovers.
And then above the average line, we've got in A, pirates and artists. And then in our seminal group, we've got Stony Age, Tudors, and ancient Greece.
I don't think that any primary school sort of child should not have some experience of those things. Probably most iffy about the Greeks, but if you can manage to get, it sort of could be covered in sort of, as long as you're covering that sort of history of democracy. Yeah. I mean, it could form a component within another unit, but I think that the Stone Age and the Tudors are really sort of important times in sort of British history. And Stone Age, obviously in world history, I think that there are a few sort of other sort of topics I'd like to see, I think, in history more. But I do. I think that's appreciate that every school has to sort of make a decision and national curriculum. I think I definitely think that sort of in Tudors, sort of the it's that age of exploration, which I think that was the name of the unit back in the old QCA units. Sort of the age of exploration. We do need to sort of focus upon sort of that sort of resulting, how the modern age was formed from that, and all the horrible things that entails.
Yeah, precisely. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Jack, and fascinating from start to finish. Thank you very much for giving us your time today.
Thank you, Kieran.
And there we have it, a truly fascinating chat full of superb insights into the world of primary education. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, follow, or leave a review, depending on where you're listening. And if you have any questions for any of my guests, head over to the Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics YouTube channel and leave a comment and let the conversation continue long into the night. Until next time, thanks for listening.